The sun was beginning to bid farewell on the Everglades horizon, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected on the calm waters of the Okeechobee River. Jake Turner observed the landscape from the porch of his small wooden house, while quietly sipping an iced tea. At 32, he had chosen a life far from urban chaos, dedicating himself entirely to the conservation of the Everglades wildlife. "Another day comes to an end, Scout," he said to his dog, a tan mutt that accompanied him on all missions. "Tomorrow we have another patrol to make." The Simple House, located on the outskirts of Cypress Creek, was also a small sanctuary for rescued animals. In the yard, adapted cages and improvised enclosures housed everything from injured hawks to small mammals in recovery. Jake had transformed his property into an unofficial rehabilitation center, respected by local residents, but viewed with suspicion by ranchers in the region. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Jake was already preparing his old pickup truck for the daily patrol. The vehicle, as worn as it was resilient, carried basic rescue equipment, medications, and food for the animals. Scout jumped into the truck bed, eager to start the day. "Good morning, old Joe," he greeted the elderly man fishing on the riverbank as he drove down the dirt road. "Going to save more critters today, Jake?" The fisherman smiled, revealing sparse teeth. "Be careful, son. I heard there are strange folks roaming around here lately." Jake nodded, but didn't give it much importance. It wasn't uncommon for strangers to appear in the Everglades, especially lost tourists or adventurers seeking exotic photographs. What he didn't know was that this time, old Joe's warning had merit. After several hours traversing Everglades trails, Jake decided to explore a more isolated area where he rarely went. Something drew him in that direction, an intuition he couldn't explain. Scout, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, suddenly became alert, her ears perked up in a sign of attention. It was then that, rounding dense vegetation, he spotted a clearing, and in the center of it, something that made his blood run cold, a rusty cage partially covered by bushes. His heart raced. He parked the truck and grabbed his equipment bag, approaching cautiously. "Stay here, Scout," he ordered, and the dog, though reluctantly, remained in the vehicle. As he approached the cage, Jake felt a mixture of anger and compassion. Inside, a buffalo calf, trembled, visibly frightened and mistreated. The small animal, which couldn't have been more than a few months old, had scratches across its body and dull fur, a sign of malnutrition. "Hey, little one, it's okay now," he whispered, crouching down to the animal's level. Carefully, he began working on the wire that kept the cage closed. His skilled hands, accustomed to this type of situation, quickly managed to weaken the structure. The calf watched every movement with eyes wide with fear. "Who would do this to you?" he murmured, more to himself than to the animal. When he finally managed to open the cage, he slowly extended his hand to the calf, trying to gain its trust. To his surprise, after hesitating for a few moments, the little buffalo took a step in his direction, as if it knew that this human represented its only chance of survival. It was at that exact moment that Jake felt a presence. He raised his eyes and saw among the trees a pair of intense eyes watching him. A mare of majestic bearing, with a black mane and vigilant posture, remained motionless, attentive to each movement of the man. The mare let out a low neigh, as if assessing the intruder's intentions. Jake was paralyzed. It wasn't uncommon to find wild horses in the Everglades, but this mare seemed different. There was an almost human intelligence in her gaze, a determination that intrigued him. The calf in the cage let out a weak sound, almost like a plea for help, and the mare took a step forward, still keeping a safe distance. In that instant, Jake understood. He wasn't facing a simple rescue. There was something bigger happening. Something he still couldn't fully comprehend. The mare showed no aggression, only calculated caution, as if deciding whether this human was trustworthy. "I won't hurt you," he said in a low voice, remaining still so as not to startle the yoe. "Animals. I'm here to help." What Jake didn't know was that this encounter would forever change the course of his life, and that in the shadows of the Everglades, human eyes were also watching him, with intentions far less noble than his own. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. Jake remained motionless, breathing slowly while the mayor observed him intensely. In that silence, heavy with tension, he made a decision. He moved away from the cage and sat on a fallen log a few meters away, keeping his hands open and visible, a universal gesture of peace. The mare, which he mentally decided to call Sierra, maintained her vigilant posture, but slightly relaxed her ears, a subtle sign that the man, accustomed to animal behavior, didn't miss. The calf, still trembling, finally found the courage to leave the cage. Its fragile legs barely supported the weight of its debilitated body, but there was determination in its hesitant steps. Instead of running directly to the mare, as Jake expected, the little buffalo stopped halfway, as if torn between two worlds. "Go. On, little one. She's waiting for you," whispered Jake, his heart tightening at the scene. It was then that the calf, which Jake mentally named Max, looked at him with an expression that seemed almost like gratitude, before turning to Sierra. The mare let out another low neigh, and the calf finally approached her, but maintained a respectful distance, as if both were recognizing each other after a long separation. Jake knew he needed to act. The calf was visibly dehydrated and injured, in need of urgent care. Slowly, he took his backpack and removed a water bottle and some basic medicines. With each movement, Sierra tensed, but didn't retreat. "I need to help him," Jake said aloud, as if the mare could understand him. And, in some strange way, he felt that she did understand. With calculated steps, he approached the calf and offered water in a small bowl. Max hesitated before drinking eagerly, while Sierra observed every detail. Jake took the opportunity to examine the animal's wounds, noting that, although not deep, they required treatment to prevent infections. "You need to come with me," he murmured, more to himself than to the animals. But how to convince a wild mare to follow a stranger? The answer came in a surprising way. After finishing treating the calf's most superficial wounds, Jake stood up and began to walk slowly toward his pickup truck. To his surprise, Max followed him with hesitant steps, and, after a moment of apparent indecision, Sierra also began to move in the same direction, maintaining a safe distance. Scout, who had been watching everything from the truck, barked excitedly upon seeing the trio approach. Jake made a gesture for her to calm down, fearing she might frighten the new companions. He quickly adapted the truck bed with straw and dry leaves, creating a space where the calf could travel with some comfort. "Come on, Max. It's just for a while," he said, helping the calf climb into the truck. The real challenge would be Sierra. Jake didn't expect her to enter the vehicle, but he also couldn't leave her behind. To his surprise, the mare simply stood next to the truck, as if waiting for the next step. "Are you going to follow us?" he asked, feeling a bit foolish for talking to the animal, as if conversing with a human. The answer came in the form of a soft neigh. When Jake started the engine and began to drive slowly back home, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw Sierra, following the truck at a constant distance, her eyes never leaving the vehicle where her protégé was. On the way back, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the strange bond between those two such different animals. A wild mare and a buffalo calf. How had this happened? And who had imprisoned little Max in that cage in the middle of nowhere? Upon arriving at his property, the sun was already beginning to set again. Jake quickly prepared an improvised enclosure near the house with fresh water and hay. He helped Max get down from the truck and led him to the shelter, under the watchful eye of Sierra, who remained a few meters away. "You're safe here," he promised, observing how the calf already appeared to be calmer, drinking water eagerly. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. From his bedroom window, he observed the enclosure where Max was resting, and to his surprise, Sierra remained there, lying near the fence like a tireless sentinel. That scene, illuminated by the silvery light of the full moon, seemed to have come from a fantastic tale, something that defied the logic of the natural world he knew. What Jake didn't know was that, while he contemplated that unlikely animal, partnership A dark car was discreetly parked on the dirt road a few kilometers from his property. Inside it, two men observed the house through night vision binoculars. "It's here, he brought them here," said one of them, with a deep and determined voice. "Tell the boss we've found our target." The first rays of sunlight were already coloring the sky when Jake woke up startled. He had spent the night in a chair near the window, from where he could observe his new protégé. To his surprise, Sierra continued exactly in the same place, motionless like a living statue, her attentive eyes fixed on the calf that slept peacefully in the improvised enclosure. After a quick coffee, Jake prepared a nutritious mixture for Max and some medications to treat his deeper wounds. He approached the enclosure cautiously, always under Sierra's watchful eye. The mare showed no aggression, but also did not lower her guard. "Good morning to you both," he said in a low voice, entering the enclosure with the supplies. "Let's see how you're doing today, little warrior." Max surprisingly seemed stronger. His eyes no longer showed so much fear, and he accepted Jake's approach without hesitation. The man was carefully examining the calf's wounds when he heard a vehicle approaching. Scout began to bark, alerting to the arrival of visitors. Who could it be at this hour, he muttered to himself, leaving the enclosure. A Fish and Wildlife Service truck parked in front of his house. Two uniformed men got out, an older one with grey hair and a severe expression, and a young man who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Jake Turner?" asked the older one, approaching with firm steps. "That's me. How can I help you?" "I'm Charles Morgan, Chief Inspector of the Fish and Wildlife Service in this region, and this is my assistant, Luke. We received an anonymous complaint about illegal rescue activity and maintenance of wild animals without authorization." Jake felt a chill down his spine. For years he had been conducting his rescues without problems with the authorities, who usually turned a blind eye to his work. Recognizing its importance in a region where public power rarely reached, "You know that my work is temporary rehabilitation. All animals are returned to nature as soon as they're healthy," he argued, trying to stay calm. Charles ignored the explanation and walked toward the enclosure where Max was. His eyes widened slightly upon noticing Sierra's presence, who stood up in a fluid movement, positioning herself protectively between the men and the calf. "A buffalo calf and a wild mare?" he questioned, with an expression that mixed curiosity and suspicion. "That combination is unusual." "I found the calf trapped in a cage yesterday during my patrol. The mare seemed to be looking after him. I couldn't leave them there." Luke, the assistant, approached Sierra cautiously, fascinated by the animal's defensive posture. "I've never seen anything like this," he commented, genuinely impressed. "They seem to have a special bond." Charles gave the young man a disapproving look before turning his attention back to Jake. "Regardless of the story, you don't have authorization to keep these animals here. The calf is of an endangered species and needs to be taken to an official conservation center." "And what about the mare?" asked Jake, fearing the answer. "She'll have to be relocated to an appropriate reserve," Charles replied, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "We'll return tomorrow with adequate equipment to transport them. In the meantime, take good care of them." As soon as the inspectors left, Jake sat on the porch step, his mind bubbling with concerns. Something about that visit didn't seem right. Why now, after so many years, had the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to intervene? And how did they know so quickly about Max and Sierra? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a motorcycle approaching. It was Julie Sanders, a biologist and longtime friend, who occasionally helped Jake in his more complex rescues. "I found something interesting in that cage you mentioned," she said, without even greeting him first, her young face marked by a serious expression. "These aren't ordinary trappers." Julie took from her backpack some photographs she had taken at the place where Jake had found Max. "Look at these marks on the ground. They're from heavy vehicles, probably trucks. And this cage, it has a specific design used for international animal transport." Jake examined the photos with growing attention, a knot forming in his stomach. "Do you think—" "I'm almost certain," confirmed Julie, lowering her voice as if afraid of being heard. "We're facing a network of wildlife trafficking, and not just any network. By the level of organization, it must have powerful connections." Jake's gaze involuntarily shifted to Max and Sierra. The calf had approached the fence where the mare was posted, and the two touched noses through the bars in a gesture of intimacy that moved even the pragmatic scientist at his side. "We need to find out more about these two," murmured Julie, observing the animals' interaction. "This relationship between different species isn't natural. There's something else happening here." It was at that moment that Jake noticed a small detail that had escaped him, a discreet symbol tattooed on Max's hind leg, partially hidden by fur. "Julie, come see this," he called, approaching the calf cautiously. The biologist examined the mark with professional interest, quickly taking some photos with her cell phone. "It looks like an identification code. I'll research this. I have some contacts who can help," she promised, putting away her phone. As they talked, they didn't notice a drone discreetly flying over the property, so small and silent that not even Scout noticed it. On the other side of the transmission, in a dark room miles away, someone watched every movement of Jake, Julie, and the animals with malicious interest. "They're starting to connect the dots," said a female voice, coldly calculating. "We need to accelerate our plan." "What about the fish and wildlife guy?" asked a man at her side. "Charles is with us. He'll ensure the animals are transferred to our facilities. The calf and the mare are just the beginning. The real prize is yet to come." Night had already fallen when Julie returned, this time accompanied by a middle-aged man, with deep wrinkles around his eyes and the air of someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jake, who was feeding Max, rose with suspicion upon seeing the stranger. "This is Richard Allen," Julie introduced, noticing Jake's tension. "Former Fish and Wildlife Service employee. We can trust him." Richard extended his hand, which Jake shook after a moment of hesitation. "Julie showed me the photos of the mark on the calf," explained Richard, his deep voice carrying an accent from the interior. "I've been monitoring endangered species in the Everglades for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The three sat on the porch while Scout settled at Jake's feet, still observing the newcomer with canine caution. Richard took a folded paper from his pocket and opened it on the improvised table. "This is a map of the main wildlife trafficking routes in the region. The mark you found on the buffalo corresponds to a cataloging system used by an international organization. They're not just common traffickers, they're involved with illegal genetic research." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of research?" Richard hesitated, exchanging a significant look with Julie before continuing. "Hybrids. Crossbreeding between different species, seeking to create animals with specific characteristics, either for sale as exotics or for some other purpose we don't know, which explains the unusual behavior between the calf and the mare." "Are you saying that Sierra and Max are part of some experiment?" Jake couldn't hide his horror at the possibility. "I'm not sure yet, but it's a hypothesis," replied Richard cautiously. "The most concerning thing is that we have information about infiltrators in official bodies facilitating these operations." Understanding hit Jake like lightning. "Charles Morgan." "Exactly," confirmed Richard. "He's not here to protect the animals, but to recover them for the organization. If he takes Max and Sierra tomorrow, we probably won't see them again." Heavy silence fell over the group. From the enclosure, Max emitted a low sound, almost as if he understood the seriousness of the situation. Sierra, as always, maintained her vigilant posture, her intelligent eyes fixed on the three humans. "What can we do?" Jake finally asked, his determination growing in the face of the threat. "I can't let them take them." Julie leaned forward, her expression more serious than Jake had ever seen. "Richard has a plan, but it's risky. We need to expose the entire operation, not just save Max and Sierra." The former Fish and Wildlife Service employee nodded gravely. "Have contacts in the FBI and an international wildlife protection NGO. We've been monitoring this network for months, but we've never got concrete evidence. Max and Sierra could be the key to dismantling the entire operation." "And how do we do that?" Jake felt simultaneously apprehensive and determined. "We'll let Charles take them," replied Richard, raising his hand to contain Jake's immediate protest. "But not before we implant trackers in the animals. Julie brought the necessary equipment. We'll follow the signal to their operations base and, with the FBI on standby, we'll make the biggest bust of wildlife traffickers in the country's history." The idea of allowing his protégés to be taken made Jake's stomach contract, but he knew they didn't have many options. Richard was clearly experienced, and Julie trusted him completely. What if something goes wrong? What if we lose the signal? Or if they discover the trackers? That's why we're going to implant 2 different types, explained Julie, removing small, innocent-looking devices from her backpack. A conventional one, which they'll probably look for and find, and another, experimental one, developed especially for this type of operation, practically undetectable. While they discussed the details of the plan, Luke, Charles's young assistant who had accompanied the inspection earlier, silently approached the house. No one had noticed him until Scout began to bark furiously. Jake stood up with a jump, ready to confront the intruder, but Luke raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't come as an enemy," he said hastily, his voice trembling slightly. "I know what Charles is planning. I don't agree with it." Richard and Julie exchanged distrustful looks, but Jake, always sensitive to people's intentions, saw sincerity in the young man's. "Heise, come in," he invited, to the surprise of the others. "Tell us what you know." Luke entered nervously, sitting on the edge of the chair offered to him as if ready to flee at any moment. "I started at the Fish and Wildlife Service only 3 months ago," he explained. "I dreamed of working with conservation, protecting the Everglades. But I soon realized something was wrong. Charles receives strange calls, has secret meetings, and whenever we find traffickers, some inexplicably escape." "Why did you decide to help us now?" asked Richard, still suspicious. Luke looked at the enclosure where Max was resting next to the fence, as close as possible to Sierra. "Because of them. The way they behave, it's not natural, but it's beautiful. Charles mentioned something about successful experiments and inestimable value in the market. I can't be part of that." Jake felt a mixture of relief and concern. An ally inside the Fish and Wildlife Service would be valuable, but Luke also represented a risk. If he were discovered, the entire plan could be compromised. "What do you propose?" he asked directly. "Charles plans to come with a larger team tomorrow, not just to pick up the animals, but to clean up any evidence you might have found," revealed Luke, his face pale in the dim light of the porch. "I can delay the operation, give you more time to prepare everything." A tense silence fell over the group as each evaluated the implications of this new information. It was Julie who finally spoke. "If we're going to do this, we need to start. Now, implanting the trackers in the animals will take time, especially considering we need to do this without stressing them." "I agree," said Richard, standing up decisively. "Luke, you go back to Charles and act normally. Any change of plans, you let us know. We have a secure frequency radio you can use." While the others discussed the technical details of the operation, Jake walked to the enclosure, observing Max and Sierra under the silvery moonlight. The mare raised her head as she felt his approach, her eyes reflecting the light like dark diamonds. "I promise I'll protect you," whispered Jake, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We're going to end this once and for all." The early morning advanced as Julie worked meticulously, implanting the tracking devices in Max. Surprisingly, the calf remained calm throughout the procedure, as if understanding that this intervention, despite the momentary discomfort, was for his own good. Sierra watched everything attentively from the adjacent fence, occasionally emitting low neighs that seemed to calm the young buffalo. "I've never seen behavior like this between such different species," commented Julie, applying a local anesthetic. At the point where she had inserted the more sophisticated microchip, almost microscopic, it's as if she really considers herself his mother. Jake nodded, fascinated by the connection between the 2 animals. During the last few hours, he had noticed how Max responded to the sounds emitted by Sierra, as if they shared their own language, inaccessible to humans. "Sierra will be more complicated," said Richard, preparing the equipment for the next procedure. "Wild mares don't usually accept manipulation easily." To everyone's surprise, when Jake approached Sierra with the syringe containing a mild sedative, the mare remained motionless, her eyes fixed on his, as if she were evaluating his intentions. After a moment that seemed to extend infinitely, she lowered her head, allowing him to inject the medication into her neck. "Unbelievable," murmured Richard, genuinely impressed. "She trusts you." While they waited for the sedative to take effect, Luke received a message on his cell phone. His face paled as he read the content. Charles changed the plans. "They'll come at 6 in the morning, not at 9 as they had said initially," he informed, his voice betraying his nervousness. "We have less time than we thought." A look of determination passed between the four conspirators. Julie accelerated her movements, skillfully implanting the trackers in Sierra, who was now sufficiently sedated not to resist, but still conscious. "Done," she finally announced, applying a healing spray on the site of the small incision. They both have the two types of trackers. The conventional one is in an obvious location where Charles will probably look. The experimental one is practically invisible, even in a detailed examination. Richard quickly configured a tablet with the tracking software, verifying that both signals were working perfectly. "Now comes the hardest part," he said with a serious countenance. "We have to let them be taken, without raising suspicions." Jake felt his stomach contract. The idea of voluntarily handing over his protégés to traffickers went against everything he believed in, but he knew it was necessary for the success of the larger plan. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked, verbalizing the fear that all shared. "I have FBI teams and international agents positioned at strategic points," assured Richard. "As soon as we have the exact location of their operations base, we'll take action. I promise we'll do everything possible to recover Max and Sierra safely." Luke, who needed to return before his absence was noticed, said goodbye with a tense wave. "I'll do what I can to delay, Charles. Give you as much time as possible," he promised, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The following hours were of intense preparation. Julie and Richard established a monitoring base in an abandoned house a few kilometers from Jake's property, equipped with cutting-edge technology to track the tracker's signal. Jake, in turn, had the most difficult task, to feign indignation, but eventually yield when Charles came to get the animals. When the first rays of sun began to color the Everglades horizon, Jake sat beside the enclosure where Max and Sierra rested. The effect of the sedative had passed, and the mare was again alert, observing him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "I'll bring you back," he promised in a low voice, carefully caressing Max's muzzle as he approached the fence. "Trust me." The sound of vehicles approaching broke the moment of intimacy. 3 Fish and Wildlife Service trucks and a truck adapted for animal transport parked in front of the house. Charles was the first to get out, followed by Luke and 4 more men of rough appearance who didn't seem like regular employees of the service. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," greeted Charles with false cordiality. "We came as agreed." Jake stood up, mentally preparing himself for the role he needed to play. "We didn't agree on anything," he responded firmly. "These animals are under my protection, and I won't hand them over." Charles smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. We have a court order," he said, extending an official document that Luke had mentioned was falsified, but which seemed perfectly legal. The men accompanying him were already moving toward the enclosure, carrying animal restraint equipment. Sierra reacted immediately, positioning herself protectively in front of Max, her ears pointed backward in a clear demonstration of aggression. "She'll attack if you approach," warned Jake, secretly proud of the mare's defensive posture. "Don't worry," replied Charles with a sinister smile. "We have ways of dealing with rebellious animals." One of the men drew a tranquilizer dart gun, aiming it at Sierra. Jake's heart accelerated, but he knew he needed to maintain his composure. Any imprudent movement could compromise the entire operation. "Please," he said, playing the role of a desperate but resigned man. "At least let me calm her down. I don't want her to get hurt." Charles hesitated for a moment, then nodded rigidly. Jake slowly entered the enclosure, approaching Sierra with smooth movements, whispering words of comfort. To his surprise, the mare seemed to understand, slightly relaxing her defensive posture. "Everything will be all right," he murmured, only for her to hear while caressing her neck. "I'll find you. I promise." With a heavy heart, Jake moved away, allowing the men to enter the enclosure. Luke strategically positioned behind Charles, made a discreet gesture of encouragement. The plan was in motion, and now they could only hope that it would work. As he watched the men partially sedate Sierra and put ropes on Max, Jake struggled against the impulse to interfere. Every fiber of his being screamed to protect those innocent creatures, but he knew that true protection would come through the complete dismantling of the trafficking network. "Don't worry, Mr. Turner," said Charles with false sympathy, noticing his anguished expression. "They'll be well cared for at our rehabilitation center." The looks they exchanged were loaded with hidden meanings. Charles, believing he had won, displayed a triumphant smile. Jake, feigning defeat, hid behind his downcast expression the fierce determination of a man with a plan. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The silence that fell over the property after the convoy's departure was almost oppressive. Jake remained motionless on the porch, observing the dust that still hung in the air, witness to the silent violence that had just occurred. Only when the last vehicle disappeared around the bend in the dirt road did he run to his pickup truck. In 15 minutes, he arrived at the abandoned house, where Julie and Richard had established the monitoring post. The place, an old farmhouse hidden among century-old mango trees, was the perfect hideout, close enough for quick action, but distant enough not to raise suspicions. "The signals are strong," informed Julie as soon as he entered, pointing to 2 small pulsating lights on the digital map projected on her laptop. "They're moving south, following the course of the Okeechobee River." Richard, on a video call with a serious-looking man, just waved at Jake, indicating he was in an important conversation. "Understood, Agent. We'll keep in touch," he concluded, ending the call. "The FBI is positioned. As soon as we have the exact location, they'll take action." The following hours were of growing tension. The tracker's signals remained constant in their movement to the south, until, to everyone's consternation, the first tracker, the conventional one, suddenly stopped transmitting. "They found and deactivated the first one," concluded Richard without surprise. "It was expected." "And the second one?" asked Jake, feeling his heart accelerate. "Still active," reassured Julie, pointing to the light that continued to pulse on the map. "Now they're changing direction. They seem to be entering private property near the border with Georgia." Richard immediately made another call, sharing the coordinates with the authorities. Meanwhile, Julie enlarged the satellite image of the region. "This area belongs to a company called Gen Life Research," she informed, reading the data that appeared on the screen. "Supposedly, an agricultural research company." "Perfect front for illegal operations," commented Richard, ending the call. "The FBI is mobilizing, but it will take a few hours to get there without raising suspicions." Jake felt frustration grow inside him. Each minute that passed was one more minute with Max and Sierra in the hands of those criminals. "We can't wait that long. What if they decide to move them again, or worse?" He didn't complete the sentence, but the fear was clear in his eyes. Richard put a hand on his shoulder, understanding. "I understand your concern, but we need to do this the right way. If we act impulsively, we put everything at risk, including the animals' lives." At that moment, Julie's cell phone vibrated with a message from Luke. "Charles isn't here. Left for meeting with bosses. Something big happening today. Need help." The Bajum 3 exchanged worried looks. Luke was risking more and more to help them, and now he seemed to be in danger. "He's at their base," concluded Julie. "We need to do something." That's when an idea emerged in Jake's mind. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it could work. "I know that region like the back of my hand," he said, a plan rapidly forming. "There's a back entrance to the property, through a swamp that few know about. I can enter without being seen, locate Max and Sierra, and maybe help Luke." Richard shook his head, skeptical. "It's too dangerous. You don't have training for this type of operation." "But I know the Everglades better than any agent," insisted Jake, "and I know those animals. They trust me." After a heated discussion, they reached a compromise. Jake would go there, but only for reconnaissance, equipped with a communication and video transmission device. He wouldn't take any action without authorization from Richard, who would maintain constant contact with the FBI. With the equipment prepared and a detailed map of the region, Jake departed in his pickup truck, his heart heavy with responsibility, but determined to do his part. Julie would accompany him to a certain point, operating a drone that would provide aerial images of the property. When they reached the closest point they could access by vehicle, the sun was already beginning to set, painting the Everglades sky with dramatic orange tones. From there on, Jake would continue alone, on foot, through almost invisible trails that only experienced eyes could detect. "Be careful," asked Julie, adjusting the small microphone camouflaged in the collar of his shirt. "Any sign of danger? You come back immediately." Jake nodded, checking the small tablet that would show his position in relation to the animal's signal. With a last wave, he disappeared among the dense vegetation, moving silently as he had learned in years of work in the Everglades. The walk was arduous, through swampy terrain infested with mosquitoes. As he approached the Gen Life property, the natural scenery gave way to an altered landscape, with deforested areas and high fences. Crouching in the vegetation that bordered a clearing, he finally had his first view of the complex. It wasn't a simple farm, as he expected. It looked more like a military installation, with modern buildings surrounded by high walls and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. In the center of the property, a larger building, with the appearance of a laboratory, shone, with intense lights despite the late hour. Through the communicator, Jake described what he saw to Richard and Julie. "The signal is coming from that central building," he informed, consulting the tablet. "But there's no way to enter without being seen. Security is heavy." "Maintain your position," ordered Richard. "The FBI is already on the way. They should arrive in less than an hour." It was then that Jake noticed movement at the back of the complex. A small truck was entering through a side gate, followed by two vehicles with Fish and Wildlife Service logos. Through binoculars, he recognized Charles getting out of one of them, accompanied by a woman of elegant posture and severe expression. "It's Rachel Oliver," exclaimed Richard upon seeing the images transmitted by Jake, "Regional Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. That explains a lot." The revelation hit Jake like a punch. The corruption was even deeper than they imagined, reaching the highest levels of the organization responsible precisely for protecting wildlife. As he watched, another vehicle arrived, this one more luxurious. From it descended a middle-aged man, impeccably combed gray hair and expensive suit, clearly someone of high position. "Anthony Miller," murmured Richard, the recognition evident in his voice. "Influential businessman, finances political campaigns, has contacts all over the world, especially in Asia." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. It wasn't just a trafficking operation, but a complex network involving corrupt authorities, powerful businessmen, and probably illegal research. "I see Luke," Jake suddenly informed, adjusting the focus of the binoculars. "He seems to be arguing with Charles, and he's pointing to the central building." A chill ran down his spine. Something told him that Luke was in danger, possibly betraying his own participation in Jake's operation. And if he was right, Max and Sierra were about to be moved again, perhaps to a location where they would never be found again. It was then that a familiar neigh, laden with anguish, echoed across the property. Sierra. And the sound came from the central building, where the lights were now intensifying as if an important operation was about to begin. Jake felt the blood boil in his veins. The FBI would take too long. Luke was in danger. Max and Sierra needed him now. "I'm going in," he announced, ignoring Richard's immediate protests on the communicator. "We have no choice. It's now or never." "Jake, don't do this." Richard's voice sounded urgent in the communicator. "It's a suicide mission without support." But Jake had already made his decision. He turned off the communicator, keeping only the tracking device active so his allies could monitor his location. The determination in his eyes rivaled only the fear he felt as he contemplated the fortress in front of him. Taking advantage of the commotion caused by the authorities' arrival, he moved quickly along the edge of the property, using the vegetation as cover. Years exploring the Everglades had taught him to move silently, almost invisible between shadows and plants. As he approached a fence at the back of the property, he noticed something promising. a drainage system where large concrete pipes conducted water from the property to the adjacent swamp. One of them seemed wide enough for a person to crawl through. It's risky, but it might work, he thought, evaluating the pipe that projected outside the fence. With one last look at the starry Everglades sky, as if seeking courage in the constellations that had always guided him, Jake entered the dark pipe. The smell of mold and stagnant water was suffocating, and the darkness almost complete. He advanced slowly, using his cell phone as an improvised flashlight, trying not to think about the possible inhabitants of that damp and confined space. Water moccasins and alligators would not be uncommon visitors in such conditions. After what seemed like an eternity, but probably wasn't more than 10 minutes, Jake spotted the exit. The pipe emptied into a service area near the complex's generators. Fortunately, there were no guards in sight. Emerging cautiously, he consulted the tablet. The signal from Max and Sierra came from the central building, less than 100 meters away. Moving from shadow to shadow, Jake approached the main building. Through an illuminated window, he glimpsed the interior, a sophisticated-looking laboratory with equipment he would never expect to find in the middle of the Everglades. Scientists in white coats moved between benches and computers, apparently oblivious to the outside world. A service door at the back offered the best chance of entry. It was locked but didn't seem to have an alarm. Jake removed from his pocket a small case with basic tools he always carried for rescue work. He never imagined he would use them to pick a lock, but life had led him to this point. After a few tense minutes, the door yielded with a soft click. Jake entered quickly, finding himself in a dimly lit service corridor. The cold air conditioning contrasted drastically with the humid heat of the Everglades, causing him a slight shiver. Following the signal on the tablet, he advanced down the corridor, staying alert to any sound. The building was surprisingly silent for a place with so much activity. Only the constant hum of electrical equipment broke the sepulchral silence. Turning a corner, Jake froze. Voices were approaching. Quickly, he hid in a small storage room, leaving the door ajar to observe. "The Chinese investors will arrive in an hour?" said a female voice that he recognized as belonging to the Fish and Wildlife Service Director, Rachel. "We need to have everything ready for the demonstration." "And we will," replied a male voice, deep and confident. "The Hybrids project is ready for presentation. Years of research finally bearing fruit." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. Hybrids project? What were they doing with Max and Sierra? As soon as the voices moved away, he continued his journey, now with even more urgency. The signal led him to a more isolated area of the complex, where the corridors became wider and the doors more spaced. One of them, larger than the others and protected by an electronic security system, seemed to be his destination. "How am I going to get past this?" he thought, evaluating the control panel next to the door. The answer came in the unexpected form of Luke, who appeared at the end of the corridor, walking nervously in his direction. Before the young man could show surprise, Jake pulled him into the storage room where he had hidden previously. "What are you doing here?" hissed Luke, his eyes wide with fear and surprise. "If they discover you, we're lost." "I need to get Max and Sierra out of here," replied Jake with determination. "Where are they?" Luke hesitated for a moment, conflict evident on his young face. Finally, sighing, he pointed to the door with electronic security. "There, it's the main laboratory, where they keep the experiments," he explained, his voice trembling slightly. "But it's not just about the buffalo and the mare, Jake, it's much bigger." "What do you mean?" "I've been passing information to Richard for weeks," confessed Luke, surprising Jake. "But only today did I get access to confidential files. They're not just trafficking animals. They're creating genetically modified hybrids to sell as exclusive products to rich collectors. Max isn't just an ordinary buffalo. He's the result of genetic manipulation." The revelation hit Jake like lightning. Suddenly, the unusual behavior between Max and Sierra made sense. "And Sierra? She's his biological mother, in a way," explained Luke, lowering his voice even more. "They used her eggs, genetically modified, to create Max. That's why the bond between them is so strong. She instinctively recognizes the calf as hers, despite the different appearance." Jake felt nauseous at the perversity of that experiment. Using the sacred nature of the maternal bond for commercial purposes was a level of cruelty he could barely comprehend. "I need to get them out of here now," he stated, with renewed determination. "Can you open that door?" Luke nodded, pulling an access card from his pocket. "I can, but there are cameras inside. We'll be discovered in minutes." "The FBI is on the way," informed Jake. "We just need to buy time." With a resigned sigh, Luke agreed to help. They cautiously approached the door, and the young man passed the card through the reader. With a discreet beep, the door slid to the side, revealing an environment that seemed more like something out of a science fiction movie. The laboratory was spacious, with immaculate white walls and intense lighting. In the center, large glass tanks contained what appeared to be developing embryos. On the sides, modified cages housed various animals, many of which Jake had never seen before, creatures that seemed like impossible mixtures of different species. And there at the back of the laboratory, in a larger and more elaborate enclosure, were Max and Sierra. The calf seemed downcast, connected to various monitoring devices. Sierra, in turn, was restrained by reinforced straps, but still desperately, trying to approach her calf. The sight broke Jake's heart. Without thinking twice, he ran toward the animals, followed closely by Luke. "I'll deactivate the restraint systems," said the young man, heading to a control panel. "You take care of the animals." While Luke worked quickly on the computer, Jake approached Sierra, speaking softly to calm her. The mare recognized him immediately, her expressive eyes showing a mixture of relief and desperation. "Everything's going to be fine. I'm here now," he promised, beginning to release the straps that held her. Max's restraint system was more complex, with various electrodes connected to his small body. Jake looked at Luke, silently asking for guidance. "Wait just one more second," murmured the young man, typing commands into the computer. "Done. System deactivated." The electrodes on Max switched off automatically, and the last straps holding Sierra also released. The mare immediately moved to the calf, gently touching him with her muzzle as if checking his condition. "We need to leave now," urged Luke, looking nervously at the cameras. "I'm sure we've been noticed already." As if confirming his words, an alarm began to sound, red lights flashing throughout the laboratory. The main door opened violently, and Charles entered, accompanied by 2 armed security guards. "Impressive, Mr. Turner," Charles's voice echoed through the laboratory, icy and laden with disdain. "I didn't expect to see you so soon, and Luke, I confess your betrayal surprises me." The guards advanced, weapons in hand, while Charles remained at a safe distance, his face a mask of false tranquility that barely disguised the underlying fury. "Step away from the animals," ordered one of the guards, a man of intimidating proportions. Jake instinctively positioned himself between the armed men and the animals, while Luke remained paralyzed, fear evident on his young face. "What you're doing here is criminal," declared Jake, trying to buy time. "Illegal genetic manipulation, trafficking of endangered species, corruption of public agent, the list is long, Charles." A sarcastic smile formed on the lips of the corrupt officer. "And who's going to stop us? You?" he mocked. "Don't be naive. This project has protection at the highest levels. A few sacrificed animals are a small price to pay for scientific advancement and, well, for the substantial profits, of course." While Charles spoke, Jake noticed a subtle movement behind him. Sierra had fully risen, her posture revealing a tension that he recognized well. The mare was preparing to attack, her eyes fixed on the men who threatened her calf. Jake knew he needed to distract Charles and his goons, preventing them from noticing Sierra's imminent reaction. "Why this obsession with creating hybrids?" he asked, taking a step forward, subtly moving away from the animals. "What's the real objective?" Charles laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine joy. "Business, Jake. Pure and simple. Do you know how much a collector in China or the Emirates would pay for a unique animal never seen in nature? Millions. And we're just beginning. Imagine the possibilities when we completely master this technology." "It's sick," intervened Luke, recovering a bit of courage. You're playing God, creating monstrosities to satisfy the whims of millionaires. No, my dear Luke, we're evolving, retorted Charles, his tone condescending. Nature is slow and imprecise. We accelerate and perfect the process. It was at that moment that the laboratory door opened again, and Rachel entered, accompanied by Anthony Miller and an Asian man in an impeccable suit. Their faces showed shock upon perceiving the situation. What does this mean, Charles? Demanded Rachel, her voice cutting. The investors arrived for the presentation, and we find this chaos. Minor setbacks, Dr. Rachel, replied Charles, trying to maintain his composure. Nothing we can't resolve quickly. Anthony Miller's gaze fixed on Jake, a spark of recognition crossing his face. You're the Everglades conservationist, aren't you? He asked, surprisingly calm given the situation. I've heard about your work. Impressive, although somewhat idealistic. And you're the financier of all this abomination, retorted Jake, unable to contain his contempt. How can you sleep at night knowing what you're doing to these animals? A cold smile formed on the businessman's lips. With the help of expensive pills and the certainty that I'm making history. We're pioneers, Mr. Turner. One day we'll be recognized as visionaries. The Asian investor, until then silent, approached. Max with undisguised interest. Is this the specimen I was told about? The hybrid of mare and buffalo? He asked, his accent heavy. Exactly, Mr. Zhang, confirmed Rachel, recovering her professional posture. One of our first successful experiments. Observe the muscle structure and unique coloration. While she spoke, Jake noticed that Sierra was becoming increasingly agitated. The presence of so many people around her calf was visibly stressing her. With a discreet look at Luke, he tried to communicate that something was about to happen. The young man seemed to understand. Slowly, he positioned himself closer to the control panel, his hand hovering over what appeared to be an emergency button. And what about the side effects? Questioned Jake, raising his voice to keep everyone's attention on him. You mention the successes, but how many animals suffered and were discarded until you reached Max? An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. It was Rachel who finally answered, her voice clinical and distant. Science requires sacrifices. Each failed specimen brought us closer to perfection. Perfection? Jake couldn't contain his indignation. You're creating aberrations to sell as exotic pets. This isn't science, it's genetic vandalism. Charles, clearly irritated with the direction of the conversation, made a gesture to the guards. Enough talk. Take these two to the security room. We'll deal with them after the presentation. It was at that exact moment that Sierra acted. With a deafening neigh, the mare reared up on her hind legs and advanced in the direction of the men. The movement was so sudden and powerful that everyone was momentarily paralyzed. The guards, reacting by instinct, pointed their weapons at the enraged animal. Seeing this, Jake launched himself in their direction without thinking of the consequences. "Don't shoot," he shouted, colliding with one of the security guard's arm at the exact moment he fired. The shot echoed through the laboratory, but fortunately missed its target, hitting only electronic equipment which exploded in a shower of sparks. Chaos set in instantly. Luke, taking advantage of the confusion, pressed the emergency button, activating the sprinklers and plunging the laboratory into an artificial deluge. Taking advantage of the confusion, Jake ran to Max, who was trembling in terror. Sierra continued to keep the men at bay, her powerful hooves maintaining even the armed guards at a respectful distance. "This way," shouted Luke, indicating an emergency exit at the back of the laboratory. "This door leads directly outside." Jake guided Max in the indicated direction, while Sierra, as if understanding the plan, slowly retreated, keeping herself between the group and her calf. The water from the sprinklers made the floor slippery, making movement difficult for everyone. Charles, soaked and furious, tried to block the passage. "You're not going anywhere. These creatures are worth millions." Sierra, as if responding to this threat, advanced again, forcing Charles to jump to the side, slipping and falling awkwardly on the wet floor. The Asian investor and Rachel tried to flee through the main door, while Anthony Miller, surprisingly calm despite the chaos, just observed the scene with an expression that mixed irritation and a strange fascination. Jake, Luke, Max, and Sierra finally reached the emergency door. Luke quickly typed a code on the panel beside it, and the door opened with a hydraulic hiss. The fresh air of the Everglades night invaded the laboratory, bringing a promise of freedom. "Go!" shouted Luke, pushing Jake. "I'll hold them here." "No," protested Jake. "You're coming with us." One of the guards, recovering from the initial confusion, fired again. The bullet grazed Luke's shoulder, who screamed in pain and fell to his knees. Jake hesitated, torn between helping his new friend and protecting the animals. It was then that a familiar sound reached his ears. Sirens, many sirens, rapidly approaching. "The FBI!" he exclaimed. "They've arrived." The sound of sirens seemed to multiply each second, echoing across the property like an announcement of imminent justice. Charles's eyes widened in panic, his previous arrogance completely dissipated in the face of the new reality. "We need to get out of here," he shouted to Rachel and the others. "Erase everything. Destroy all evidence." Anthony Miller, however, remained strangely calm, adjusting his tie with studied elegance, as if he were just preparing for a routine interview. "Too late for that, Charles," he said, his controlled voice contrasting with the chaos around. "I always had a contingency plan." Jake, still supporting the injured Luke, watched with confusion as Miller took a small electronic device from his pocket and pressed a button. Immediately, all the laboratory lights went out, being replaced by a reddish emergency lighting. "Security protocol activated," announced a computerized voice. "All exits sealed. Data destruction procedure initiated." Rachel's eyes widened in shock. "What did you do?" she questioned, her voice trembling. "This wasn't in the plan." "The plan was always mine, dear," responded Miller coldly. "You were just disposable tools." Charles advanced furiously against the businessman, but was stopped by one of the security guards, who surprisingly pointed his gun at him instead of at the intruders. "My real guard," explained Miller with a satisfied smile. "Did you really think I would trust you completely?" The revelation of the betrayal left Charles and Rachel momentarily stunned, giving Jake the opportunity he needed. Taking advantage of the confusion, he helped Luke stand up, while whispering instructions to Sierra, who seemed to understand perfectly, positioning herself protectively near Max. "Let's go," urged Jake. "The emergency door is still open." The UI group began to move toward the exit when the Asian investor Mr. Zhang blocked their path. "The animals aren't going anywhere," he declared firmly. "I paid a lot of money for them." To everyone's surprise, it was Anthony Miller who interfered. "Let them go, Zhang. The animals are the least of our problems now. We have to save the research." While the two argued, Jake took the opportunity to guide the group out of the laboratory. The Everglades night air never seemed so sweet and invigorating. Outside, the chaos continued. Lights from patrol cars illuminated. The complex and FBI agents advanced in tactical formation, weapons in hand. Richard, wearing a bulletproof vest with the FBI badge, ran in their direction as soon as he spotted them. "Thank God you're all right," he exclaimed, quickly assessing Luke's wound. "Medics are on the way. Stay here." "Be careful in there," warned Jake. "The situation is complicated. Miller seems to have activated some kind of self-destruct protocol." Richard nodded gravely, speaking quickly into his radio before joining the agents surrounding the building. Loudspeakers demanded the immediate surrender of all present, while helicopters flew over the property, their powerful searchlights sweeping the terrain. Julie appeared running, her face a mixture of relief and concern upon seeing her friends. "The medics are on their way to take care of Luke," she informed, quickly examining the young man's wound. "It doesn't seem very deep, thank God." Sierra remained close to Max, her vigilant eyes observing the intense movement around. The calf, although visibly frightened, seemed stronger now that he was beside his protector. "We need to take them to a safe place," said Jake, gently caressing Sierra's muzzle. "Away from all this." Julie nodded, pointing to a veterinary ambulance. That had just arrived. Richard thought of everything. "They'll be taken to the wildlife sanctuary in Pine Ridge. There they'll be protected while we decide what's best for them." Jake's heart tightened with the idea of separating from the animals, but he knew it was for the best. The sanctuary had resources that he couldn't offer, especially considering Max's special needs due to his hybrid nature. A deafening boom interrupted his thoughts. An explosion shook the laboratory, glass shards flying in all directions. Agents ran shouting orders, while a cloud of black smoke began to rise from the building. Self-destruction, murmured Luke weakly. Miller was prepared for this, probably destroying evidence. Moments later, figures began to emerge from the smoke. Scientists with raised hands, disarmed security guards, all surrendering to the authorities who quickly surrounded and handcuffed them. Charles and Rachel were brought together, both with expressions of defeat and impotent fury. When they passed by Jake, Charles briefly stopped. "This doesn't end here," he hissed, eyes injected with hatred. "There are others like us. The demand exists, and where there's demand." A police officer pulled him rudely, leading him to a patrol car. Rachel didn't even raise her gaze, her once imposing posture now reduced to a downcast shadow. It was then that a warning cry sounded among the agents. Anthony Miller had emerged from the burning building, but instead of surrendering, he was running toward a smaller helicopter, parked in a secluded area of the complex. "He's going to escape!" shouted Richard, running in the direction of the fugitive businessman. But it was Sierra who reacted more quickly. With a powerful neigh, the mare shot like an arrow, leaving Max protected at Jake's side. In seconds, she reached Miller, blocking his path with her imposing presence. The businessman, desperate, drew a gun he had kept hidden and pointed it at the animal. It was his fatal mistake. Before he could shoot, agents surrounded him from all sides, forcing him to lower the weapon and finally surrender. Sierra calmly returned to join Max and Jake, receiving affectionate strokes from both as a reward for her bravery. As the night progressed, the chaos was gradually replaced by order. Ambulances arrived, taking Luke and other wounded to nearby hospitals. The animals from the laboratory, many of them grotesque results of failed experiments, were carefully rescued and transported to specialized facilities. Max and Sierra were the last to be transported. When the veterinarians approached with restraint equipment, Jake intervened. "That won't be necessary," he assured, gently caressing Sierra's neck. "They'll come voluntarily." With gentle words and soft gestures, he guided the two animals to the special transport. Sierra hesitated briefly on the access ramp, looking at Jake as if asking if she could trust. "Everything will be all right," he promised, his eyes fixed on hers. "I'll visit you. That I guarantee." As if she perfectly understood, the mare finally entered the vehicle, followed closely by Max, who seemed more confident with each day. As the vehicle moved away, Julie approached, placing a comforting hand on Jake's shoulder. "We did the right thing," she said softly. "Thanks to you, we dismantled one of the country's largest networks of trafficking and illegal experimentation with animals." Richard joined them, his face exhausted but satisfied. "The documents we managed to recover before the destruction are pure gold," he informed. "Names, dates, international contacts. It will trigger investigations in at least 5 countries." Jake nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The victory had been achieved, but at a high price. Luke injured, animals suffering, and the revelation of a network of corruption and cruelty much larger than he had imagined. "What about Max and Sierra?" he asked, his greatest concern still with his protégés. Richard smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I have an idea about that," he replied, looking at the horizon where the vehicle transporting the animals was now just a distant point. "But we need to talk about it tomorrow with rested heads." The sun was beginning to rise on the Everglades horizon, illuminating the ruins of what was once a laboratory of horrors. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of justice and perhaps a fresh start for all those involved in that extraordinary story. 6 months had passed since the operation that dismantled the GenLife Research Laboratory. Spring had arrived in the Everglades, transforming it into a green and exuberant carpet, dotted with wildflowers that defied the recent drought. Jake observed this renewal of nature from the porch of his house, which now housed an official sign: Everglades, Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Fish and Wildlife Service, UF. Much had changed in that semester. The investigations triggered by the recovered documents led to the arrest of dozens of people worldwide, including corrupt fish and wildlife service officials, businessmen, and international traffickers. Anthony Miller, Charles, and Rachel faced processes that would likely keep them imprisoned for decades. More importantly, the experience had transformed Jake's life. With the support of Richard, now promoted to regional coordinator of the Fish and Wildlife Service, his rescue and rehabilitation work gained official recognition. The small property was expanded with resources from the government and international NGOs, becoming a reference center in conservation. "All done, you stubborn one," said Julie, finishing applying medicine to a recently rescued blue macaw chick. "Now you'll get better soon." Julie had left her previous job to officially join the center's team, bringing her scientific expertise to complement Jake's practical knowledge. The partnership worked perfectly, with her meticulousness balancing his more intuitive approach. "How's Luke?" asked Jake, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. "Recovering well. Physical therapy is helping with his arm movement," replied Julie, sitting beside him. "He said he intends to return to work next month." Luke had become an unlikely hero. His testimony was crucial to dismantling the entire criminal network, and his courage in risking his own life to save the animals earned him a position in the Environmental Inspection Department as soon as he was fully recovered. Jake smiled, satisfied with the news, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't tell anyone, but he missed Max and Sierra every day. He received regular reports about their welfare at the sanctuary in Pine Ridge, but it wasn't the same as seeing them, as feeling the special connection they had developed. The distant sound of a vehicle approaching interrupted his thoughts. They weren't expecting visitors that day, and the road leading to the property was rarely used by strangers. "Who could that be?" asked Julie, standing up to see better. An official Fish and Wildlife Service truck appeared around the bend, followed by an animal transport truck. Richard got out of the first vehicle, his habitually serious face now illuminated by an enigmatic smile. "I have a surprise for you," he announced without preamble as he walked toward the porch. Jake felt his heart accelerate, a suspicion forming in his mind, but fearing to create false hopes. "What surprise?" he asked, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. Richard made a gesture toward the truck, where two employees were already lowering the rear ramp. After much discussion, the Sanctuary's Scientific Council concluded that some animals have special needs, explained Richard, clearly savoring the moment, needs that only specific caretakers can meet. It was then that a familiar neigh echoed, a sound that Jake had heard in his dreams over the last few months. Sierra emerged majestically from the truck, her coat shining healthily under the Everglades sun. And right behind her, trotting with the growing confidence of youth, came Max. Jake stood motionless, unable to believe what his eyes were seeing. Tears formed involuntarily, blurring his vision. "But how?" he finally managed to ask, while watching the animals being guided out of the truck by the handlers. "Officially, they're being transferred to an environment more suitable to their specific needs, under continuous scientific supervision," explained Richard with a smile. "Unofficially, they're coming home." Julie let out a small cry of joy, running to receive the newcomers. Jake, however, remained on the porch, momentarily paralyzed by emotion. It was Sierra who took the initiative, gently disengaging from the handlers. The mare walked directly toward Jake, her intelligent eyes fixed on his, as if they had never been separated. Max followed her closely, his physique already showing the signs of the transition from infancy to youth. When Sierra stopped in front of him, Jake finally moved. He slowly extended his hand and touched the animal's muzzle, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they had shared. "You came back," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Richard approached, observing the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and respect. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said in a more serious tone. "The research done with DNA samples from Max revealed something surprising. Besides buffalo and horse genes, he possesses human genetic traits." Jake moved away from Sierra, shocked. "What? How is that possible?" The Gen Life Scientists were far beyond what we imagined, explained Richard. Apparently they were experimenting with a revolutionary technique, inserting human genes to increase the cognitive capacity of the hybrids. That's why Max demonstrates such unusual behaviors, almost human. The revelation was disturbing, but somehow made sense. The way Max looked at Jake, how he seemed to understand complex situations, had always seemed extraordinary even for an intelligent animal. "What does this mean for him?" he asked, concerned about the possible complications for the animals. "Health and welfare." "We're still studying, but so far he seems healthy and well adapted," replied Richard. "What we know for certain is that he's unique, and as such he needs unique care which only you can provide." While they talked, Max approached Jake, gently touching his hand with his muzzle, a gesture so full of trust and affection that it momentarily dissipated all concerns. Human or animal or something in between, Max was simply Max, an extraordinary creature who deserved to live his life in the best way possible. In the weeks that followed, the center's routine adapted to accommodate the new residents. A special space was created for Sierra and Max, with free access to pastures and the adjacent forest. Scientists visited regularly to study Max's unique development, but always under Jake's attentive supervision, who insisted that the animals' welfare always come first. On a particularly tranquil afternoon, as the sun began its descent on the Everglades horizon, Jake watched Max and Sierra peacefully grazing. The young hybrid's growth was remarkable, not just physical, but also in terms of behavior and intelligence. He had begun to communicate through specific gestures and vocalizations, developing his own language that Jake and Julie were learning to interpret. "He really is extraordinary," commented Julie, joining Jake at the pasture fence. "Yesterday, he managed to open the stable gate by himself, using his muzzle to lift the latch. It's not just animal intelligence, there's something more there." Jake nodded, observing how Max seemed to be attentive to the conversation, though he was several meters away. "Sometimes I wonder what the limit will be," he confessed. "How far will he develop, and how will we deal with that?" "One day at a time," replied Julie, wise in her simplicity, "and with a lot of love. In the end, that's what we all need, isn't it? To be accepted as we are, whatever our nature." The sun continued its downward path, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that reflected in the Everglades waters. Sierra and Max, silhouettes against the sunset, walked side by side, their different bodies but their souls connected by a bond that transcended the barriers of species. In that moment, Jake understood that some stories don't really have an ending. They continue, evolve, transform into something new each day. The saga of Max and Sierra, and now his own, was just beginning. His phone vibrated with a message from Richard. "Initial report of international investigations completed. Network bigger than we imagined. We need to talk." Jake put the phone away without immediately responding. There would be time for that tomorrow. Today he just wanted to be present in this moment, witnessing the miracle of life that continued before his eyes, against all odds. A feeling of peace flooded his heart as he observed the two figures in the pasture. What had begun as a casual rescue had transformed into a life mission, not just to save animals, but to protect the very concept of nature's integrity, to defend the right of each being to live according to its essence. The gentle evening breeze brought the familiar smell of the Everglades, damp earth, wildflowers, and fresh water. In the distance, the chorus of birds announced the end of another day. Scout, Jake's faithful canine companion, joined him in silent contemplation, as if she too understood the importance of that moment. "You know, Julie," he finally said, breaking the contemplative silence, "I learned something important from all this." "What?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the golden sunset. "That the bonds that really matter aren't determined by nature, by science, or by genetics," he replied, observing how Max and Sierra now approached the fence, as if they wanted to be part of the conversation. "They're determined by the heart." Julie smiled, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that spoke of a connection that had also grown during those intense months. She needed no words to express what everyone already knew, that in that piece of the Everglades, an unlikely family had formed, united not by blood, but by something much stronger, the choice to care for each other against all odds, against all expectations. And as the first stars began to dot the increasingly dark sky, Jake knew, with absolute certainty, that he had found his true purpose, not just as guardian of the Everglades, but as guardian of an idea, that we all deserve a chance to be who we are destined to be, free from cages, whether they are physical or imposed by arbitrary limits of what we consider natural or possible. Max let out a low sound, almost like a word, and Jake smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, no doubt. But today, in this perfect moment, it was enough to be here, witnessing the miracle of bonds that remain even when the entire world says they shouldn't exist. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from.